What happened when ancient Hebrews saw someone lose reality? Today, we use medical language, therapy, and diagnosis. But in the ancient world, explanations sounded very different. Fear, faith, community boundaries, and survival shaped every response. This episode explores that difficult question with historical care. In ancient Hebrew society, identity was deeply communal. A person's behavior affected family, neighbors, and village reputation. There was no psychiatrist waiting behind a city gate. There were priests, elders, relatives, prophets, and frightened crowds. What modern people call mental illness had many meanings. It could look like punishment, impurity, possession, or disgrace. Sometimes, it was interpreted as a warning from God. Sometimes, it was simply feared as dangerous public disorder. The Hebrew Bible never offers a psychiatric treatment manual. Instead, it preserves stories, laws, prayers, and warnings. Those stories reveal how people understood disturbing behavior. They also reveal how vulnerable people could become isolated. Ancient Hebrews lived inside a strongly spiritual universe. So unusual behavior was rarely treated as merely biological. A troubled mind could be seen through divine conflict. A public outburst could bring shame upon relatives nearby. This does not mean everyone responded with cruelty. Families probably tried to protect their own first. But when behavior threatened order, communities drew hard lines. The village was small, visible, and socially intense. Everyone noticed shouting, wandering, confusion, or strange speech. They asked, what spiritual meaning stands behind this? That question shaped nearly every response they imagined. One response was prayer, because God ruled life. Another response was music, especially in Saul's story. King Saul is described as spiritually tormented and unstable. David plays the lyre, and Saul finds relief. Yet the text explains it through spiritual language. Saul's episodes involve fear, rage, suspicion, and decline. The Bible connects his distress with rejected kingship. So his suffering becomes personal, political, and theological. Mental collapse was never just private in kings. When rulers broke down, entire nations felt unstable. Nebuchadnezzar offers another famous and deeply troubling example. Daniel describes him driven away from human society. He lives like a beast until his reason returns. Historically, that story belongs to theological court literature. But its image of exile remains completely unforgettable. Madness becomes humiliation before divine sovereignty and judgment. Powerful kings could become powerless bodies outside civilization. The message was not clinical, it was moral. Pride rises high, then sanity itself collapses downward. Again, the treatment is not recognizable hospital care. The person is removed, humbled, and later restored. Restoration matters, because the story does not end outside. Nebuchadnezzar returns with recognition, praise, and changed perspective. Another famous example appears in the New Testament. The Gerasene man lives among tombs and mountains. He is isolated from ordinary village life completely. The account describes chains, fear, crying, and separation. Today, viewers may recognize severe psychological suffering there. But the gospel frames the crisis primarily spiritually. The community's response is containment, not medical healing. They try restraint because they fear public danger. Tombs represent exclusion, impurity, loneliness, and social death. He is not at home, table, or synagogue. He is beyond the boundary of safe belonging. In that world, boundaries protected the living community. Outside were graves, wilderness, spirits, and deep uncertainty. Distressed people could be pushed toward those margins. Some wandered deserts because towns could not manage them. Some were chained when fear overcame compassion completely. Some were ignored until a prophet or healer arrived. These responses sound harsh to modern ears today. But they came from limited knowledge and deep fear. Ancient people lacked neuroscience, medication, and emergency services. They had kinship, ritual, prayer, and social control. Priests handled impurity, sacrifice, and access to community. Elders judged disputes and protected fragile village order. Families carried shame when members behaved unpredictably in public. Hebrew wisdom literature also speaks about fools and madness. But those words often mean moral disorder instead. They do not always describe psychiatric illness directly. Biblical language can mix ethics, emotion, and sanity. That is why modern readers must be cautious. Not every strange behavior equals a medical condition. Not every spiritual description equals psychological ignorance either. Ancient texts speak from their own symbolic world. We should listen before translating everything into diagnoses. Still, many scenes show real human distress clearly. They show terror, isolation, shame, confusion, and lost dignity. They show communities struggling without modern healing tools. They also show restoration as a powerful hope. To be restored meant returning to human fellowship. It meant clothing, speech, worship, memory, and recognition. The person became visible again as a neighbor. That may be the deepest historical insight here. Ancient Hebrews feared madness, but feared disorder even more. They protected the community, sometimes at terrible personal cost. The suffering person often carried the burden alone. Yet biblical stories also challenge exclusion and indifference. They ask whether social restoration can follow humiliation. They ask whether compassion can cross forbidden boundaries. So, what did ancient Hebrews do with the disturbed? They prayed, restrained, isolated, interpreted, warned, and sometimes restored. The answer is uncomfortable because history is uncomfortable. But it helps us understand their world honestly. Ancient responses were shaped by fear and faith. They lacked medicine, but not meaning or concern. Their world treated disturbance as spiritual and social crisis. Some were excluded, others were restored through sacred intervention. If this helped, like, subscribe, and comment your thoughts.